Most of the interviews we do here are with global experts. They often have PhDs and are academics, but occasionally we will interview a graduate student or undergraduate student, usually when a professor recommends something that they've written. And so we're going to do that today with Luke Faulks, who has written a paper called Evaluating the Regulation of Independent Power Producers in a Hydro-Based Electricity System, Lessons for BC from Quebec and Norway. It's the Clean Energy Research Working Group, paper number 5 for the Simon Fraser University. So welcome to the interview, Luke.
Hi, very glad to be here, Markham. Thank you.
Well, look, I've done a fair amount of interviewing and reporting on BC Hydro and on the BC electricity system and independent power producers. So I'm very interested to see what you have to say. I liked your paper, but why don't we start with just just give me a brief overview of the paper, please.
Sure thing. So when I started out, I wanted to figure out a way to help fill what is expected to be an energy gap in BC. We've recently adopted a number of new climate proposals, one among them new targets for electric vehicles that involve us getting to 100% of all new vehicles sold being electric by 2040. Now, even though we don't have in BC the domestic capacity to create those electric vehicles, if we're going to hit that target, we're going to need to massively expand our charging infrastructure in this province to help tackle that distance issue inherent in electric vehicles. Now, unfortunately, at the same time, BC put a stop in 2019 to our standing offer program, which was our main way of signing on new electrical facilities, producers of electricity, which were, for this province, independent power producers. In BC, we have a mandate saying that BC Hydro cannot build small-scale electrical facilities. That responsibility is outsourced to mostly private independent power producers. My challenge was to find a way for BC to move forward to expand its array of renewable energies to tackle climate change, while also making sure that we can meet our targets. Now, what I'm proposing is using independent power producers in a more public-facing way. So bringing on smaller municipalities as independent power producers to generate that electricity, to meet that gap.
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue because BC has a reputation of being a reliable producer of clean hydropower. It's got 97% hydro. And it's quite a celebrated system. British Columbia is very proud of the system. But here's the problem. You put your finger on it, and that is if you electrify transportation, building stock, and industry, you probably need 2 to 3 times the 18,000 plus megawatts of generating capacity that the province currently has. And it is building one more hydro dam, at least it hopes it'll get it completed, Site C, which has 1,100 megawatts of generating capacity. So if you need 36 or 54,000 megawatts, where are you going to get it from? And BC Hydro has said it will never build another hydro dam, so you're not going to have any more hydro dams. And then where's it going to come from? I mean, this is it's the logic of the government's own climate policy, and no one seems to be addressing it yet. And so I find that interesting. So you're arguing that municipalities, First Nations, basically community players should be allowed to be independent power producers, and that's where we can find, British Columbia can find all of that power.
Absolutely. So I look to Quebec and Norway, both of whom lean into public producers of energy more heavily than BC has over the last 2 decades. What we see with both of those cases is that they've been able to increase their capacity, their diversity of supply in order to tackle that intermittency problem that's sort of endemic to renewables, while relying more heavily on public producers of that power. Now, BC has not indulged in that. In fact, in particular for Indigenous groups wishing to become utilities, it's like pulling teeth. There's a number of lawsuits involved in Indigenous groups wanting to become utilities and producers of power, but the system that we have just does not encourage that sort of behavior. Now, what Norway and Quebec have done is public producers of power, for Norway in particular, have taken over hydroelectric facilities, while private producers have been pushed out into developing other renewable sectors. So with Norway, in particular after 2008, after public production of energy was strengthened by legislation called Proposition number 61. We've seen a rise in publicly owned hydroelectric facilities at the municipal and county level, while private producers have been pushed out into wind. So we've seen a takeoff of wind in Norway, largely fueled by private producers. The same sort of thing can happen here with protections on public resources for public organizations and pushing private organizations into developing BC's frankly underdeveloped wind sector and bioenergy sector.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should point out with Norway that the biggest developer there is Equinor, which is the old Statoil. It's the state-owned oil and gas company, and they're big into offshore wind. And
Yes.
And with Quebec, Quebec Hydro has done a little bit. I mean, Quebec Hydro is probably the best run public utility in all of Canada, in my opinion, anyway, and the opinion of the experts I interviewed. So, okay, this is interesting. So, what, and I want your opinion on another trend within the utility industry, and then you see this in Europe, and you see it in the United States in particular. And that is all of the trends toward distributed energy, towards using the grid and the utility as a platform. So instead of this vertically integrated monopoly, you've got a flat structure where the utility becomes a platform for many players to generate electricity and trade electricity. All of those trends go exactly against the BC model. And then what you're talking about is essentially a BC spin on these trends, these horizontal trends that we're seeing in other areas, other jurisdictions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's difficult for the utility to claw back that power. It's already been somewhat devolved. So BC in particular has had, I want to characterize it as kind of a violent de-evolution of BC Hydro's capacity with a sort of one-size-fits-all mandate that pushes the responsibility to private organizations. It's difficult to claw that power back, and BC Hydro has its own issues with transparency. But to bring on other public utilities at the municipal level or at the Indigenous level seems like a valid way to go. It's what Québec has done. They have a substantial number of more publicly owned utilities that are producing energy, producing renewable energy that is then sold and that those communities can then profit off of. It's a valid economic development model for remote communities in BC to host these energy projects and then to start profiting off of them. And it's something that BC definitely should be looking at.
Yeah, another point that was made, and Peter Asmus from Insights, I did an interview with him, and he's in Guidehouse Insights microgrid expert. And his point was that with the way grids are going, they'll actually become a web of microgrids or a web of smaller grids. And it seems like that is kind of where what you're suggesting should happen. It fits into that, and it lowers costs, it adds resiliency, it has a lot of other benefits in addition to economic development benefits. Was that a fair statement?
Absolutely. One of the key hurdles for remote communities in BC wanting to become independent power producers is connection costs for requisite infrastructure to connect, say, a solar facility in a remote community to our grid. That's why independent power producers in the late 2000s had a run on the most profitable sites that were close to our grid, close to transportation lanes. And that's why remote communities have such a hard time becoming independent power producers, or it's one of the many reasons why. So microgrids could take care of that issue of having to connect to BC's wider grid. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's another problem, and you've alluded to this a couple of times, which is BC Hydro's culture. And we should point out that the cost of service utility model, as utilities all over the world are the same. They're very cautious, conservative, because their job is to produce power at a reasonable cost and do it reliably. So they're not risk takers. And so the idea of having other people connect to their grid is they're not very happy about it. They're not very, they're not good at it. And we hear stories, I hear stories all the time from the people I interview about how BC Hydro is 3 years to get a connection to the grid. And that makes, industry that wanted to do it moves on because they just can't move at the speed of BC Hydro. And those sorts of stories. And that's a very difficult, if you're going to leave BC Hydro in control of the grid, that's a very, very difficult thing to overcome.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a number of legendary issues with BC Hydro. Before the IPP boom, yes, BC Hydro was providing BC with some of the lowest rates of electricity in North America? Absolutely. BC still has those low rates, but it's subsidized to a degree where the province is losing money, where it purchases independently produced power from private organizations at higher rates than it then sells to BC ratepayers. So it's becoming an issue where BC Hydro is both not transparent, not easy to deal with, but is also losing money to these private organizations on a gamble that's not necessarily paying off and providing BC with lasting assets that will remain around and produce enough electricity for us to transition cleanly.
Well, let's talk about that, because that was a big issue. Was in 2019, there was a report out, it's called Zapped, and it was all about how the previous government, the Liberals, had basically, it was classic political analysis, right, or scapegoating. It blamed the IPPs, blamed the government for giving the IPPs all these juicy contracts that were way above market rates, and that had cost BC Hydro and consumers billions and billions of dollars. It was a great political scandal at the time. But I've done a lot of research in BC Hydro documents and interviewed a fellow named Ron Monk, who was an engineer and ran BC Hydro's energy planning department at one point. And one of the things that, this is a story that doesn't get told, and I'd be interested in your view on it, and that is BC Hydro's load growth prior to 2008 used to grow at 2% a year. And starting in 1995, they were projecting off and out into the future and saying, by 2020, we will be short like 80,000 megawatt hours a year of electricity. We've got to find that someplace. And one of the areas they were going to find that power was with IPPs, with independent power producers. And so they started contracting, partly because the government told them to, around 2007, 2010. And what happened around that time? We had the global financial crisis. We had the Great Recession. And what happened was, from 2010 on, BC load growth is flat. Never mind 2%. It wasn't 1%. It was 0%. So all this power that they had contracted for, that was more expensive than what they could generate with their own dams, they were stuck with it. They had no use for it because their growth had disappeared. And Ron Monk told me that they did not expect this. It was completely unexpected. They had anticipated growth would resume at 2% after the Great Recession was over. And so you have raised in your paper an issue about BC Hydro's long-term load forecasting, which, over the last 10 years, hasn't been all that great. What argument did you make about it in your paper?
Part of the issue that I took with BC Hydro's long-term load casting is the fact that it doesn't take into account those massive leaps in electrification necessary to combat climate change. Basically, the solution to climate change is electrify everything. Transportation, the building sector, electrify all of it to reduce emissions. The unpredictability of BC Hydro's load casting forecasting model, which you just alluded to, that extends to combating climate change. To say that BC Hydro's, that BC's demand is going to remain consistent with the last few decades is completely erroneous when we have these new climate targets that demand massive electrification. It's the fact that BC Hydro has not yet adjusted its forecast to account for the changes post financial crisis speaks to the fallibility of their model, and the fact that as a utility, they are somewhat staid in their ways.
Right, and we should point out that the BC Hydro is currently doing a review. It's in phase 2 of a review mandated by the government. But when the government sent their terms of reference, it said you must only look at electrification for light duty vehicles. Now, there's a study that came out last year from the University of Victoria's transportation team that said if all of the transportation, heavy duty, light duty, medium duty, heavy duty in BC was electrified, it would require double the amount of electricity currently being consumed. So there's a disconnect there in that planning. The government the buck stops with the government, but then the government has passed on, it compounds the problem. Now you've got a government that seems to be out of touch with a utility that seems to be out of touch.
Absolutely, and it's a process, the review process that's going on now. The process is not open to public input. So it's concerning that the utility would take on such an input of such a review of a massive scale that has the ability to set the course for the province's next several decades. That's also not necessarily the most transparent review process ever.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've interviewed experts from the US and Canada who are, from the utility industry. And we talked about this very thing. And what they said was, do not ever ask a utility to review its own operations behind closed doors. It's a very, very bad idea, because utilities in this set become a gatekeeper, and they keep people with other ideas out. And the experts that they invite in tend to be the ones that agree with them. So you almost get a predetermined conclusion and recommendations when you do that, which I'm probably what the government wants, actually. But nevertheless, it's very, very bad policymaking, and is incongruous with the Clean BC objectives. The two don't mesh. They don't make sense, as you pointed out. And I would argue that while electrification hasn't occurred to any great degree yet, it's only just beginning. We're going to look back from 2030 if this process isn't fixed, and BC is going to be going, oops, we made a big mistake. And the stakes are too high to make those big mistakes when you're in rapid disruptive change the way the global energy system is.
Absolutely. We don't want to have to look back in 2030 when their load forecasts have continued to fail us and end up with an energy sector that is not prepared either for the dramatic changes that climate change will bring, that will end up damaging the infrastructure that is designed to produce power, or has simply left us with a massive gap as we've tried to take off with electrifying everything. So we don't want to look back in 10 years and have, frankly, the similar conversation where BC Hydro's load forecasts have continued to fail to predict what is actually going on in this province.
Well, for viewers, I'm going to link to Luke's paper in the YouTube description, so you can read it yourself. And just to let you know, I'm writing a series of essays on this very topic and on sort of BC electricity system and BC Hydro's role and the global trends that are affecting it. So watch for those over the next, probably over the summer, as I start to publish those. And I can tell you from the work that I've done, Luke's conclusions, his observations and his conclusions are right on the money. So thank you very much for this, Luke. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Markham. Much appreciated.